Recipes, Identity and Heritage, featuring Barbara Denicolò from University of Salzburg on pre-modern words in a recipe, or What Do I Have to Know About Cooking Good Food, and Lucy Long, the Center for Food and Culture, Irish soda bread recipes in the US and as document of ethnicity. There are going to be two discussants, Michelle King, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Regina Sexton, University of College Cork. And the chair is Professor Andrea Borghini of the University of Milan, will say 2 words about himself.
Yes, thank you. I can use these, it's fine, it works, yeah. So welcome everyone. I'm a philosopher working at the University of Milan, and I'm proudly also part of Relish. So it has been a pleasure, being here, and I've been actually learning a lot. Very much look forward to this session now. So the first speaker is Barbara Denicolò, and she studied history, Latin, and German studies in Innsbruck and gastrosophic sciences in Salzburg. Completed her diploma in 2013 on the account of books of Frederick Fort of Tyrol, and then earned the PhD in Salzburg in 2023 with a dissertation on cookbooks and recipe collections as discursive practices and sources for late medieval and early modern cultural history. At the moment, she's researching the court of Sigmund the Rich, and her research focuses on regional and court history in late Middle Ages and early modern period, food studies, materiality, cultural history, and digital and public history. So very much aligned to what we're doing here. So the talk, you can see the title here, Recipes as Cultural Seismographs. The floor is yours, thank you.
Yeah. Seismographs?
Seismograph.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me here. I will present some key concepts out of my dissertation. And I analyzed in my dissertation 15th and 16th century cookbooks and recipe collections from the German-speaking world. My approach treats these texts not merely as instructions for preparing food, but as cultural documents that generate and transmit knowledge across multiple social domains. And recipes in this sense are cultural texts embedded in broader systems of knowledge. That's my dissertation, which came out only recently as a book, and that's what I want to do today. I will present the key concepts of my book, situate them within the broader questions of these workshops, and outline a prospective project idea of Tyrolean culinary heritage. And that's the main reason why I'm here. I'm here to learn more about how to deal with culinary heritage, which I did not so much before because I came from a very manuscript-focused perspective. So I studied manuscripts, late medieval and early modern manuscripts, to find out which type of knowledge they contain. I used the Korema semantic model, which to systematically analyze recipes, and this model allows for longitudinal and cross-regional comparisons. And finally, I will discuss how these methods can apply to explore a more recent topic, the Tyrolean culinary heritage and Tyrol as a culinary space. My participation in this conference also serves as an opportunity to gain feedback, so don't hesitate to ask questions and give me feedback, and especially for that future research project. I started my dissertation with the famous word of Jean-Antoine Brillat-Savarin, tell me what you eat and I will tell you who you are. Because food is not purely physiological, it's always social and cultural. And the historical records, for example, I also analyzed episcopal visitations to courtly festivities, and they confirmed that what people ate, how they ate, and with whom they ate was shaped by religious, social, and medical norms, and it served also as a marker of identity. But despite this richness of the sources in the German-speaking world, culinary practices were long neglected in historical scholarship. Research focused primarily on economic and social history. They used account books, ordinances, various descriptions, Orbaria, they are called in German, and they left recipes largely to philologists. Only recently has this gap begun to be addressed, with works exploring recipes not merely as manuals, but as an evidence of intellectual processes. Recipes pose methodological challenges. They are mostly undated. They lack identifiable authors, and they are difficult to localize. While textual overlaps may suggest copying, a discursive approach sees these similarities as evidence of a stable but dynamic knowledge system maintained through variation and innovation. And recipes, therefore, are not merely practical instructions, they are cultural seismographs. They encode ideals of taste, health, hierarchy, and morality, reflecting the norms and values of the societies in which they are created. Recipe collections function as discursive practices. Each collection reflects a reception of contemporary ideas about good and proper food, linking culinary practice to broader discourses of household management, courtly display, health, religion, and social order. And recipes are further embedded within broader knowledge systems that I already mentioned, connecting household and court, human and nature, and also related textual genres, such as menus, account books, or household ordinances. And they reflect concerns about health, hierarchy, and they actively contribute also to constructing that ideals. And studying the recipes in this slide allows us to understand the interplay between material culture and textuality in historical contexts. So for the workshop, I picked out 3 analytical dimensions. So first, mobility and exchange. Recipes circulated across oral and written traditions, and understanding this mobility is crucial. Mechthild Habermann emphasizes the importance of considering the social-cultural context, including the creation and transmission of recipe collections, the origins of the knowledge they conveyed, and their intended audiences. She summarized it with the so-called Laswell formula, who says what, in which channel, to whom, with what effect. And the traditional editorial models of cooking recipes, of pre-modern cooking recipes, are influenced by Karl Lachmann's historical critical method, and they often sought to establish original texts or urtexts. And they try to hierarchizing manuscripts into stemmata, yet culinary texts rarely fit this paradigm. And Helmut Klug, in one of his very good papers, points out that the recipes often derive from shared, orally transmitted repertories, and they are adapted to local circumstances rather than copied verbatim. And this explains also the anonymity of most recipes and the difficulty of dating. Manuscript evidence shows variations in seemingly identical recipes, suggesting that direct copying played a minor role and that culinary knowledge was dynamic and adaptive. The advent of print in the 15th century slowly expanded recipe circulation across social strata, while manuscripts continued to influence printed collection. That was one of my main findings, that we have a backslash from printed collection into the manuscript tradition. Spatially, it's important to distinguish between the current location of a manuscript and its original site of production. Many manuscripts now housed in Munich, Vienna, Heidelberg, or Berlin originated in princely collections or monastic collections, and it's much more easier to localize the printed recipe collections because they are easier to localize via the printing workshop or the city in which they are printed. Authorship and agency are other two key elements for understanding the cultural meaning of recipes. Oral and written traditions were closely intertwined, and surviving manuscripts capture moments in these discursive practices rather than exact kitchen practice. And the recipes encode ideals of taste, often normative rather than descriptive, and reflecting aspirational standards rather than everyday diets. And situating the recipes in their social, cultural context allows us to interpret seemingly fictional or constructed elements, and this is a concept that I took out of the German-speaking historiographical literature. That's the reason I argue that cooking recipes weren't studied in the German-speaking historiography so far. Studying recipes in this context allow us to interpret the seemingly constructed elements as insights into underlying social ideas and norms. And recipes emerged from a complex collaborative process involving the actors, the creators, the scribes, the circulators of the recipes, later on the printers, and also the users of the recipes. And the result is a network of knowledge, a knowledge system, rather than a linear chain of individual authorship. This maybe comes only later. Medieval and early modern recipes circulated largely without attribution. If we have authorship in elite kitchen, it was male, as today, and reflecting the social hierarchies of the time. And the courtly kitchens set cultural standards, and written recipes sought to bring readers closer to these models. Yet, women also participated, albeit often invisibly. Here you have a picture of a woman. The cook is always depicted within tasting his dish, and there are always women in the picture, but more doing some preparatory works, or they are in the behind of in the backwards in the picture. So they are present, but not in the first row. Recipes are inherently interdisciplinary. They intersect with history, ethnology, archaeology, philology, art history, nutrition, or philosophy. And understanding recipes requires integrating methods and perspectives. They need textual analysis, they need material culture studies, and sociological theory. And interdisciplinary approaches enable a richer understanding of culinary knowledge as a medium of social negotiation. For instance, mention of utensils reveal technological change, while spices like saffron, nutmeg, or cinnamon reflect global trade. Combining close reading and distant reading with digital modeling allows us to trace both detailed practices and long-term trends, situating recipes within broader cultural contexts. And therefore, interdisciplinary collaboration is not merely beneficial, it is essential to capture the complexity of recipes as sources of cultural history. These are pictures of two of my recipes that I annotated with the Koroma semantic model. For me, the Koroma project offers a methodological bridge between my case study analysis that I shared now and the project idea I'm going to present. Its semantic annotation model breaks recipes down into discrete units, so the ingredients, the instructions, the tools, and of course the most important thing for me, the supplementary tips. And the model links these to standardized vocabularies. And this enabled a systematic comparison across regions and time periods, supporting both qualitative and quantitative analysis. The annotation also reveals the cultural context, especially the supplementary tips, for example, suggests ingredient substitutions, serving practices or preservation methods, providing insight into historical culinary knowledge. And therefore, I think digital modeling allows us to track ingredient trends, regional preferences, and shifts in culinary practice. And it also facilitates public engagement, embedding recipes in a wider knowledge networks and making them accessible to a non-specialist audience. As I said, the semantic model is going to help me with a new idea, a recipe research about Tyrolean culinary heritage. The Tyrolean cuisine, often presented as timeless, emerges in textual sources only in the late 16th century. We have one recipe of Marx Rumpol's Ein New Kochbuch from 1581, and this cookbook contains the earliest known written reference to Tyrol, describing a dish made of noodles with parmesan, bread, and butter. This brings up comparisons with Maestro Martino's Libro de Arte Coquinaria, but not with more modern Italian and Austrian cookbooks. So there is no continuity with modern dishes that are called Tyrolean. Yeah, the project I want to do, or I try to get funded for, combines three strategies: the semantic annotation and digital modeling of cookbooks that I found in the region of Tyrol, longue durée analysis tracing continuities and ruptures, and participatory archival research involving local communities to recover dispersed materials. And this approach situates Tyrolean culinary heritage in its historical context while offering transferable methods to other regions. And studying Tyrolean recipes allows us to interrogate how culinary heritage is constructed. So I want to use textual evidence and that shows selective recollection and reinvention rather than a continuous survival. So that's my aim, and that's the hypothesis I want to prove. Yeah, so let me conclude. The historical recipes are more than culinary instructions. They are cultural seismographs for me. They record subtle shifts and profound transformations in social life, especially from dietary trends to economic and environmental change. And the Tyrolean case shows that regional cuisines emerge less from linear continuity than from processes of negotiation and cultural adaptation. Thank you.
We move now to the second speaker, Lucy Long. So Lucy, as we pull up the slides, I'll present her. She directs the independent nonprofit Center for Food and Culture and is retired from teaching at Bowling Street, Green State University in Ohio, United States. She has a degree in folklore from UPenn and an ethnomusicology degree from University of Maryland, and focuses on food as carrier of meaning and identity and its role within tourism, heritage, and sustainability. Lucy published numerous articles. I think many of the people that are here have read probably some of her articles or books. Just to mention some: Culinary Tourism, Regional American Food Culture, Ethnic American Food Today, The Food and Folklore Reader, and Apples in the Midwestern Imagination. So the title of her talk today is Irish Soda Bread Recipes in the United States as Documents of Ethnicity. Thank you, Lucy. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. My presentation is exactly the opposite of Barbara's. I start with the subject and then move into theorizing about recipes. So I'm asking, can recipes be accurate documents for studying attitudes towards ethnicity, towards studying the status of an ethnic group? Okay, so my case study is soda bread, Irish soda bread, which is a quick bread using baking soda or bicarbonate of soda, as it is frequently called in Europe. It is considered iconic of traditional Irish foodways. It appears in different forms and functions and meanings within the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Irish diaspora in the US. So you can see the different forms there. Okay, American soda bread, or Irish American soda bread today is actually a fairly recent public appearance. And it tends to be a sweetened raisin bread, usually referred to as a quick bread, a dessert bread. So it's not considered essential to the meal. So it's a side. And it's usually found publicly in the US in grocery stores, if it is found at all, around St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, closely associated with the Irish, and it always has Irish in front of it. Okay, and so it is now appearing in what are considered the older forms. There's a whole trend towards nostalgia, and this is showing up in ethnic foods as well as mainstream American culture. Okay, so just the evolution of my study. I happened to live in Northern Ireland in the 1990s. I had 3 young children. I did not go over for research. I was tagging along with a husband who was doing research. I was immediately struck when I was there by the prevalence of soda farls, which are quarters, flattened quarters of soda bread. And these were ubiquitous and eaten all day long. You could buy them in bakeries, you could buy them in the grocery stores and supermarkets, you could buy packages to make them, and everyone seemed to make them at home also. They were eaten all day long. So I was immediately struck by that and by the variety of it. So I ended up doing an ethnography of the varieties of Irish soda bread in Northern Ireland. And while I was doing this, people would point out, they don't have this form in the Republic of Ireland. So we're Northerners, we're not considered as Irish as the Southerners. And there was this undercurrent of identity politics going on. But people were polite and nice. They didn't want to bring that out to the open. So that made me aware this is something that is considered symbolic by these people. So I then went back to the US and had a daughter who wanted to do Irish dance. She was only 3 years old. So we found an Irish dance school that was just starting up. This was 1994, prior to Riverdance. People had not heard of Irish dance, and they would say things to me like, there's actually a school for learning how to do Irish dancing. I thought, you just have to drink enough Guinness, and then you'll get up on the table. So there are these stereotypes of the Irish that were very, very strong that I was meeting with through dance and then also through Irish music. So I was also looking for Irish food because all they eat are potatoes. Are there any Irish cookbooks? 37 recipes for boiling potatoes. Okay, so there were these very, very negative stereotypes of the Irish that I kept running into. Okay, so I was making these observations, and then I started asking questions. Well, why are the stereotypes here? What does it have to do with food? Are people trying to express their identity through food, but they feel too ashamed to do that? Or they're choosing other cultural forms, music and dance, and they don't care about food? What exactly is going on? So I started doing research, ethnographic research, on on the place of soda bread and Irish American communities. Okay, interviewing numerous Irish American, including some family members and friends, but also like sending things out, through Facebook, for example, at academic conferences and through Irish American networks. And then I also started then looking at recipes as a possible document that would maybe suggest some answers. So I'm using 3 lenses here for my research. The first, the word ethnic is an ethnic group. It's kind of out of favor. And many people feel that the concept of ethnicity itself implies colonialism. However, that's why I'm using it, because the issue of power is built into the idea of being ethnic. This is a group that is living within another culture, and they have to define themselves, both their in-group definitions and their public performances have to be defined according to the group in which they are living. Okay, so power is built into the idea of ethnicity. Okay, secondly, I'm using materials, concepts from folkloristics, primarily the idea of paradigm, that we all have models for what something is, and then we enact those models according to our circumstances, the specific context in which we are performing them, our personalities. Okay, so that we can actually see recipes as paradigms, and then we can ask, where do those paradigms come from? Is the recipe a variation on a paradigm? Okay, so it gives us a framework for asking some of those questions. Okay, and then I borrow from Caterina Passidomo, who, I hope I pronounced that properly, who has a wonderful article about gastro-imaginaries in the American South, and how through food, people construct and transmit and perform an imaginary of what that culture is. So I'm looking at, do these recipes give us a gastro-imaginary of what Ireland is, of what Irish American ethnicity is? Okay, so just a little bit of background very quickly. Irish American history, of course, books have been written about this. Okay, that's my interpretive lens. Okay, the Irish in the U.S., prior to the 1800s and the early 1800s, Irish immigrants were primarily Protestant. Okay, and they were assimilated into American society. Even if they were Catholic, they were usually able to pass, and that makes a huge difference. The Great Famine and the series of famines in Ireland, starting in 1845, meant that many of the Irish immigrants coming over, the famine Irish, were coming over in a very poor health state, and they were not presenting the best of the Irish. And that became the predominant perception of who Irish Americans were, that they were poor, starving, they had been forced from their homeland. In the U.S., they were treated with great discrimination. There were signs saying no Irish need to apply. People would say things like, no Irish allowed, no dogs, no blacks. A different word, of course, from black. And a lot of this was represent anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant sentiment, as well as the English perception and treatment of the Irish as a separate and lesser race. Okay, in the 1900s, the 1960s, things began changing. A lot of Irish American historians say this was due to John F. Kennedy and his popularity. All of a sudden, it was all right to be Irish American. And by then, a lot of Irish Americans had moved from neighborhoods and menial jobs to more middle-class positions. So there were a number of other things, multiculturalism, a number of things like that going on. In the 1990s, people talk about how, this is not my expression, this is Irish American, or scholars of Irish American history, they say by the 1990s, the Irish were becoming white. They were fully incorporated into white mainstream. Okay, and there are a number of reasons for why that is. I also saw this with Irish dance and the popularity of river dance. And prior to river dance, I would say my daughter's taking Irish dance classes. After river dance became a global phenomenon, people say, oh, she's river dancing. And it was very, very well known. So it changed the perception, that and I think Liam Neeson personally, but a number of other films, rock stars that were Irish, they changed the perception of being Irish. So it's now considered very attractive, very, very sexy. However, the older stereotypes are still there. Okay, this is what happens on usually the beginning of March, leading up to March 17th. Okay, Irish beer, the Celtic heart. It's always in the alcohol section that you see these things. Okay, and here, it's frequently linked with other holidays that are celebrated in the winter and spring, that like Mardi Gras, which is known as just a huge party. So it's being linked with these other images that give a stereotype of the Irish. This is a whole paper in itself. Corned beef, a corned beef sandwich on rye with caraway seeds. Okay, that whole thing could be another paper in itself. That's considered an Irish dinner around St. Patrick's Day. So, okay, so what is considered the Irish paradigm of soda bread is 4 ingredients: flour, salt, baking soda, and buttermilk. And the buttermilk is necessary to activate the baking soda. So, and you see this in a lot of the Irish tourist cookbooks and the tourism literature, as well as cookbooks by very knowledgeable people who say this was the traditional recipe. Okay, and one quick aside, I didn't realize that baking soda was actually a fairly recent innovation. And so bicarbonate of soda wasn't even discovered until the latter 1700s. It became commercially produced in the US in the 1840s. So this is actually past the time of the great famines. So this historical timeline doesn't match up. Okay, so through my ethnographies, I had seen that soda bread was not something that was very commonly used in many Irish American families. It tended to appear only in public ceremonies or celebrations of Irishness. Okay, and so I thought, well, is this because people don't know what it is? They don't care about the food, they didn't pass it down. And the non-Irish Americans frequently would say, well, so what they use, they pour soda, like Coca-Cola, they pour that into the bread. What exactly is this? People did not seem familiar with it. So I thought, okay, I will go and check cookbooks and start looking to see if there are recipes available. And I thought, since I want to see what mainstream popular America is thinking of Irish American ethnicity and Irish soda bread, I looked for cookbooks that specifically said American cooks, or recipes for the American housewife. Okay, and then I went through the Popular Culture Library at BGSU, Bowling Green State University, where I was a professor for too many years. And we went through an entire wall of cookbooks. So, and I pulled out 60 cookbooks that I thought would work, and we found a total of maybe 15 recipes out of that 60 that we could even talk about as possibly being Irish soda bread. Okay, and you can see some of the parameters of what I was looking at. Okay, the early references and cookbooks, there actually were none. We were so excited, we thought we had found soda bread in 1824, but it was called a soda cake. It had nothing to do with soda bread. And the word cake has a very different meaning in the US with implications for how it is used than it does in Ireland. In 1861, Bridget's bread cake. Okay, and the name Bridget was frequently used as a stereotype of Irish women. It was the name given to servants. Okay, usually not cooks, because the Irish they didn't have a reputation for being good cooks, but they would be doing the laundry and the housekeeping. And they might be taught to cook, but Bridget was just kind of the name used for everyone. Okay, so this is, a little bit of stereotyping going on there. The next one I found was 1938. Okay, that's a huge leap. Okay, and this was the Home Dietitian's Cookbook, and it was Irish bread. However, there was no baking soda, no buttermilk, things that are considered essential to be soda bread. It did include sugar, raisins, currants, and caraway seeds, which are some of the add-ons that we see in later soda bread recipes. Okay, also, The Joy of Cooking, which is one of the most popular cookbooks in America and is distributed everywhere across the US. It has a soda bread, but it has nothing to do with Irish soda bread. So it's interesting that it actually even uses the name. Okay, 1950s. See, this is when the Irish-American paradigm in recipes started being established. Okay, there was the gourmet cookbook. This is reflecting also the rise in the 1950s of women staying at home and they're supposed to be cooking and aspirational recipes. Okay, and this actually does say Irish soda bread. And from here on out, all cookbooks said Irish soda bread, except for James Beard, but I don't think he's represented. So they all were designated as Irish. They're very, very important, I think. Okay, and it uses baking powder along with baking soda, which actually renders the buttermilk unnecessary. However, buttermilk stayed in there, I think, because it has a country cooking connotation for many, many Americans. Okay, so, and there probably were some practical reasons, a different type of flour, a different type of wheat available in Ireland from the US. Okay, however, we start seeing this paradigm, the American paradigm, using baking powder and baking soda. Okay, 1953, the Modern Family Cookbook, Irish soda bread. Okay, again, and it uses both baking powder and baking soda. Caraway seeds, which ironically I rarely saw in soda bread in Ireland, except for a couple of times, for special breads. So Regina can talk about that more. So, and also sugar. Okay, and this is very important because we're talking about, it's moving into this category of dessert breads, tea breads. Okay, not essential to the meal. Okay, and in 1953, it says, Ireland is famous for this bread. It is baked in almost every home, and many say it is one of the finest breads to be found anywhere. Okay, does this reflect an acceptance of the Irish as Americans? I mean, it's possibly a sign of respect. However, out of those 60 cookbooks that I looked through, this was the only recipe for Irish soda bread in 1953. So it might have been, it was starting to be acceptable, but it was not widespread. Okay, and then part of what I was trying to do was also put these within the timeline of American social history and American cookbook history. which is way too much to go into now. Okay, the 1960s, the countercultural revolution, multiculturalism in America. Okay, and because of John F. Kennedy, we do start seeing the visibility, the public visibility and acceptance of Irish Americans. Okay, so 1962, Irish soda bread in the Sunday News Family Cookbook, and it uses Bisquick mix. It says biscuit mix is what it's called, but biscuits were not the same thing in the U.S. as in Ireland. 1963, McCall's Good Food. This was also another standard household book. Okay, and this one, ironically, was closer to the Irish paradigm, okay, which was kind of surprising. 1964, The Joy of Cooking first introduces soda bread, and it's quick Irish soda bread. Okay, again, is setting it aside as this is kind of special. You know, it's not really a necessary part of your meal. And then 1966, Women's Day Encyclopedia of Cookery included a whole section on Irish cookery written by an Irish novelist. Okay, and this was an encyclopedia, so it's not surprising that, you know, that would be in there. And they had Polish American, Indian American, Chinese American. So, but it's definitely positioned as ethnic. Okay, 1970s. Okay, we start seeing the acceptance of other food cultures as a resource for creativity, health, and exploration. Okay, they're not being set as parallel to American cooking, but they're being seen as resources for exploitation, colonialism, if we want to think of it that way. James Beard, Evan and Judith Jones. Okay, and in 1982, the Jones say this romanticized stereotype, Grandma Clark's soda bread. So Grandma Clark's Irish eyes twinkled when she made this, the real thing from the old country. And that type of imagery starts showing up over and over and over again. In 1987, Jeff Smith, who had a whole series of cookbooks on immigrants and regional cuisines in the U.S., I know you have heard that Irish cooking is bland and boring. This is not so. Yes, there are a few potatoes about, but then that is what the Irish lived on in the old country, and that is what the immigrants lived on in this country. So, however, you will find the food delightful. Okay, so, you know, recognition that there are these stereotypes. Okay, so mid-1990s, I already mentioned river dance. The popularity of the Irish started shifting, but also there started being in American society concerns with authenticity. More and more of an emergence of cosmopolitanism displayed through being familiar with other cuisines. There also started emerging culinary tourism, okay, and just the idea of adventurous eating beyond going to Italy and France. You know that food could be something that tourists of all classes could enjoy. And then also there was a growing interest and recognition that food could be used for personal artistic expression, okay, as well as expressing identity. You know, so there are these other cultural movements happening that set the stage for Irish American food to be accepted. Okay, so 1997. I know I'm jumping decades here, and it kind of surprised me when I was doing this research. I mean, that's what was happening. You know, these huge gaps. Okay, the Joy of Cooking, it actually recognized there's a difference between Irish American and Irish soda bread. So it sets up that paradigm right there. And it's not a matter of let's respect this bread, it's a matter of authenticity. And people were being very concerned, is this the real thing? 2006, it actually continues the Irish American paradigm rather than the classic Irish paradigm. I know actually in Ireland, people were using the Irish American paradigm frequently. So, okay, and just an indication that Irish American food, but soda bread itself was starting to be recognized as iconic of Irish heritage is indicated in 2003, the start of a Facebook group called the Society for the Preservation of Irish Soda Bread. And I'm supposed to say Irish there. And it says there are only 4 ingredients. If you put anything else in, it's not truly Irish, and you are betraying your heritage and identity. So it's being presented very, very seriously as iconic of Irish American heritage. But how is that heritage defined? Okay, so so some of my findings. Okay, there was a confusion in these cookbooks over the word soda, because baking soda did not always mean the same thing as bicarbonate of soda. Okay, and we have soda crackers, we have soda pop, we have soda fountains, we have soda water in the U.S. And so people frequently ask me, you put soda water in this. What exactly is going on? And the cookbooks show that they reflect that confusion just over the term. Okay, we do see these two paradigms, the Irish versus the Irish American. Okay, and these are defined by ingredients, as well as by form, the loaf form as well as the round cake form, they would call it in Ireland. And certain ingredients are considered significant, more significant than others. If you want to be authentic, you use currants, not raisins. But if you're using raisins, you say it's Irish American. Okay, so that ends up being something that is an identifier. Okay, so both of these, or all of these recipes, I think, are creating gastro-imaginaries of Irish American heritage. Okay, and it is a heritage that I saw held by Irish Americans as well as by the general public. Okay, and this was a romanticized gastro-imaginary that saw Ireland actually as this potential land of plenty, except that the English had oppressed it. And, so the people had suffered, and so their foodways was reflecting that oppression and the poverty that was forced upon them. However, now Ireland is being seen as this lush, green place, bountiful and welcoming. So among non-Irish Americans, it was simply seen as the gastro-imaginary is an Ireland that is attractive and welcoming and a wonderful place to be a tourist. And if you can, you pretend that you're Irish, and on St. Patrick's Day, you can go and drink all day long with everyone else. For Irish Americans, there was an undercurrent of this narrative of we have been oppressed and discriminated against, and we have risen above it. Okay, which unfortunately also turns into racism sometimes. Okay, so so there are these two gastro-imaginaries going on. Okay, so do these recipes accurately reflect Irish American history? I was actually a little surprised to find the earlier recipes because there didn't seem to be any visibility of Irish dance or music, or even, pubs were the only public Irish American space in the American national public landscape. So I was surprised to find any recipes at all, but there were not very many. I looked through so many cookbooks for the American cook, the American housewife. They did not include soda bread. I think that does reflect attitudes from mainstream that Irish had no food worthy of commenting on or including. Did it also include attitudes within the Irish American community? Possibly. That they felt, well, it's too mundane to celebrate. We don't want to call attention to ourselves. There are a lot of reasons why maybe Irish Americans were not presenting this as iconic of their identity. Okay, so I think and we can also ask, do these recipes, particularly today, because today you can find soda bread recipes everywhere on the internet. And particularly around St. Patrick's Day, every single newspaper, magazine in America has soda bread recipes. And there are YouTube demonstrations, instructions for how to make this bread. So is this a reflection of a shift in the ethnicity, or is it just a shift in American food culture that has expanded to include everything, to consume everything? So we really have to look more closely at that. But that idea that these recipes both reflect and construct ethnicity, attitudes towards that ethnicity, and definitions of Irishness. So they both reflect and construct. I think that's very, very important. Okay, so we need to put all of this in a broader context. Plus, I recognize I came to these recipes after doing all this ethnographic research and already knowing, that there were these attitudes. So when I read the recipes, I'm kind of reading behind the lines a little bit. So I do recognize that as a flaw, as a research flaw. So, but we have to put these recipes in all these other broader contexts. And I thought about trying to do timelines, and just, can we just measure all of these things, put them in comparison. So we need to look at more cookbooks. I looked everywhere for Irish American cookbooks. I couldn't find any. It might just be, my flaws in what I had. So we also need to ask people how they use recipes. So, and one very quick anecdote to end with. Is that all right? Or don't? You're telling me time? Okay. So I think we have to go back and talk to people and do ethnographies of how people are actually using these recipes. So at a St. Patrick's Day celebration in Toledo, which was a heavily Irish city, just this past March, they were having a bake sale, a fundraiser, and they were selling Irish soda bread. Most of it was the loaf form. And so I was asking people, and it was loaves with raisins. And so one woman said, "Oh, I got this from my mother. She came over from Ireland in the 1940s. This was her recipe. It uses baking powder, raisins." She was using the Irish-American paradigm. And then I was so excited. Someone came in, and they had brown loaves of wheaten soda bread, as well as the plain soda. And these are the traditional classic loaves with a cross on top. And so I asked about that, and it was a Polish woman who had married an Irish American, and they had gone to Ireland on a trip, and she had bought some of the tourist cookbooks, that talked about traditional Irish cookery. She said, "Oh, that's where I got the recipe." So, and then another woman who came from a completely Irish-American family, and they had been there since about the 1870s, very involved in Irish dancing. I asked her where she got her recipe. And I just Google it every time I need to make this bread. So it shows the complexity of recipes in use, and some of the concerns we have to take in using them as tools for research. So, thank you.
All right, great. Thanks to both Barbara and Lucy for your papers. I really enjoyed reading them. I'm going to, I think there is actually quite a lot that brings them together, and I want to borrow the term that Lucy used, the gastro-imaginary, because I think what we've been presented with is a gastro-imaginary of region and a gastro-imaginary of ethnicity. So I think both papers are doing something similar at different scales and using different methods. But they're motivated by a similar kind of impulse. So Barbara is looking at, I think, thousands of recipes, a lot anyway, to figure out, she just mentioned at the very end, what is Tyrolean cuisine? When does it come into being? And then Lucy is looking at one specific recipe for a specific dish or a specific food item of soda bread to imagine, thinking about this gastro-imaginary of Irish American identity. So I come to this through my own interests in Chinese culinary regionalism and also, my dabbling in Asian American foodways. So yeah, I'm excited to think and talk through this with both of you. So although Barbara didn't really get to it until the very end, the part that I'm most interested in is your thinking about Tyrolean cuisine. Does it exist? When does it exist? And most importantly to me, I think, in wanting to ask Barbara, how do you know when you found it? How do you know what you're looking at is evidence of quote-unquote Tyrolean cuisine? Like, I think one of the things that is a real danger of thinking, this is my suspicion about culinary heritage in general, is that we're always casting backwards. We look at where we are from right now, and we cast backwards to look for that thing back then, right? And I think we have to be more specific about the language that's used. So, for example, although people think about Chinese cuisine as something that has existed for thousands of years, I make an argument in one of my articles that, in fact, the idea of Chinese cuisine is a very, very late idea. Not until the 19th century or 20th century do you even see people using that term in Chinese. 中国菜 or something like that. Before that, they talk about Han cuisine, they talk about different regional cuisines, but nobody is thinking about this large entity of Chinese cuisine until Chinese are met with Western imperialism in the 19th century, right? That's when we begin to think about this thing as a concept. So the same thing could be applied to Tyrol, or the idea of Tyrolean cuisine. Like, are you seeing the word in recipes? You gave that particular mention about noodles, and they mentioned the word Tyrol as a region, but are they using the term, there is something in German that is equivalent to Tyrolean cuisine? Is it a specific dish that you look at and say, oh, we're casting backwards? So that's my question for you, is how do you know when you've found, quote unquote, Tyrolean cuisine, right? As you look backward at 15th and 16th centuries. And just because, and also this is methodological because you said a lot of these texts are not dated and we don't even know where they come from. We just know the language they're written in, right? So how do you even mark Tyrolean? Like when you're looking at the specific recipe books or collections or whatever that you're looking at. Maybe some are printed in the area that is now Tyrol, but does that mark it as Tyrolean cuisine? So, how do you even know what you're looking at is that thing? And so looking at Lucy's, paper about soda bread, Irish soda bread recipes and Irish American identity, I think you've given some different ideas about, changes in Irish American ethnicity and identity. And I think that in the American context, we cannot talk about something like Irish American identity or ethnicity without talking about race. And, we can't talk about or think about this within a multicultural context, right? And I think that has to be addressed in your paper somehow, because, of course, Irish Americans, or even that term itself, right? That's one thing I want to know. Irish American, we didn't always use that term, Irish American, right? I think that this is a response to kind of the movement or, change in terminology of Asian American or African American, right? We used to use, or, the term was, maybe it was Negro and then Black and then now African American. Now people are changing back to wanting to use the term Black, right? There's all kinds of politicized language. So even the term itself of there is a thing such as Irish American identity, and I think, this resurgence, the question that I think you want to answer is why in the 90s or 2000s does that term and idea about being proud to be Irish American come back? And I'm saying it's a response to other identitarian politics and, this embeddedness within both a discourse about immigration. So thinking back to, you mentioned the Frugal Gourmet. I remember watching his program on PBS. I always came home and watched him. He wears a nice, neat apron. But Jeff Smith's book, The Frugal Gourmet, The Frugal Gourmet, on our immigrant ancestors, recipes you should have gotten from your grandmother. I love that subtitle because it's so presumptive of like how we learn about food and, you know, who's teaching it to you and whatever. But I wasn't able to find the table of contents. I was Googling it last night. I couldn't find the table of contents for which ancestry groups does he talk about. On the cover, it's him with the Statue of Liberty in the back, and at that same time, he publishes the book in 1987. In 1990 is this centennial restoration of the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island. So if you can imagine America that was celebratory of immigration and thinking about welcoming migrants and being a nation of immigrants back when that was still possible. Now that's our imaginary. But thinking about that particular kind of moment to this moment, which I think is different now, this reclamation, I want to say, of Irish American as an ethnic identity, right? Before it would have been white, and you're just coded as white. Now people are saying, hey, I too have an ethnic identity, and it's Irish American, and we're going to see it through soda bread, and et cetera, et cetera. So I want to think about, like, I would love to see you in this paper really locate that time and that space much more within this framework of a multicultural America and different groups claiming certain things, and Irish Americans as this identity group that wants to also lay claim to, you know, that's where we're seeing soda bread recipes come back up. Anyway, those are my two, you know, kind of question ideas for both of you in terms of the gastro-imaginary of both region and ethnicity.
Okay, yes. So the next set of comments will be delivered by Regina, Sexton, from whom we heard this morning from University College Cork. Yes.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Lucy. Just to remind us all, this session was titled Identity, Heritage and Recipes. And of course, the heritage one here is the active concept, because this one has a very strong presence as one of the three pillars of the Relish project. So, I suppose my response is specific to the two presentations, and thank you very much for that. I enjoy them in different ways. First of all, because soda bread connection, and secondly, because Barbara, my first discipline was history. So I could identify the historian thinking there. So I suppose I'm kind of forming two distinct categories of questions that are, on the one hand, directed to both of you, but in a more general sense, and I'm going to broaden the response, I suppose, more. These are questions that I'm putting to all of us, and particularly in the context of what we're trying to achieve here over the 2.5 days. So, as I said, the title of this session was Identity, Heritage and Recipes. And I think what Lucy did in a very impressive way was to demonstrate the mutable identities of recipes in heritage formation. And this mutability of the recipe, I suppose, is not so much the recipe doing it itself, it's an extrinsic mutability. And that, for me, brings two questions to the surface in heritage formation. And I always like going back to the kind of the baseline of things in provoking us, almost provocation, to think about what heritage is. Again, because of the fact that it's one of the pillars of the Relish project. And heritage has, like soda bread, become a very attractive thing at the moment. And we all have to have our own almost personal statements of heritage, which I find interesting. And I find it interesting kind of from recent developments, because I looked at heritage through the prism of one plant in Ireland and elsewhere as well, that being wild garlic, and how wild garlic has gone through this process of heritagization since, I think, the early 2000s. And when I was looking at that study, I had to think about heritage. And of course, like all of these concepts, and because there are academics and humans involved, there's no one answer. But the approach and the thinking I did like very much was it's an old approach, was Lowenthal's interpretation and definition of heritage. And he says that it's everywhere now. We all have it on all different levels. But what is it really? And what he says is that it seems to be a kind of a collection of history, tradition, which hasn't been kind of really surfaced at all for these 2 days, history, tradition, memory, and nostalgia. So all the different pasts that were, he says, have been sort of, I suppose, amalgamated into one lumpen mass, my phrase. So in that regard, I suppose what he talks about is pastness. And I wonder, should we be thinking about pastness in the context of these 2.5 days, and then try and sort of swing it back to heritage somewhat? And that leads me on to another question, I suppose, and this is a question of reflexivity. And as scholars who are kind of debating this idea of heritage and so on in a recipe context, and going back to my idea that this is an intrinsic application, I suppose the question to all of us is, what is our responsibility as scholars in a reflexive way? What's our responsibility to heritage formation? And then again, in the context of the Relish project. So there are my two sort of interrelated questions in that regard. Turning to Barbara, and I think you just, well, given the confines of the time and so on as well, you just kind of skimmed the surface, and it was, I think it kind of has cultivated interests in us to know what the deeper implications of your study were. But what I found interesting, Barbara, from your perspective was that, and this goes back to my question, I suppose, really for all of us and for Barbara as well, is this idea of disciplinary principles. I think you demonstrated very clearly, Barbara, that your approach was as a historian, and it was sort of how we think as historians. But you also finished your presentation by saying that this study, that kind of took the historical approach, has now encouraged you to go different places, to go elsewhere. And this is interesting because we've discussed this idea of migration of recipes and so on. But my question here, or my kind of idea for us to think about, is our migrations as scholars across the disciplines. Because, as we've been saying, and it almost goes without saying now, food studies lends itself to cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary approaches. And I suppose what has happened in terms of the kind of the origin stories of ourselves as scholars in this field is that we all have an origin story. Well, some of us anyway, I suppose. Or an etiology, that we started somewhere and we moved somewhere else. So we moved from a discipline to a field, which is kind of interesting thought. And my question around this is, in terms of ourselves, our own migrations, is that, are we in danger here of trying to satisfy too many masters? Are we trying to do everything and therefore doing nothing? And that kind of started me self-reflecting on myself from this morning, and Lisa's very useful contribution, and what she said was kind of keep it small and think small and keep it controllable. And in the sort of the fog and the storm of confusion, which these 2 days might have created, I'm wondering how we manage all of that effectively. And I suppose that's the whole purpose and the ethos, the kernel of what we're here for these 2.5 days to do. How do we manage that migration into different disciplines because of the field we're leaving in the context of relish? So there are my questions. Thank you very much. My response. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Regina. So I think I should invite the speakers here for a reply. Yeah, you can, no, but you sit here, I'll just stand up. And so you can first reply. Oh, I have another one. Fantastic. You can first start replying, and then we'll have at least 15, 20 minutes for the discussion. Yeah, go ahead. I don't know. Maybe Barbara can go first if you want, or
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You have to turn it on. Is it on from there? When it lights up. Oh, it was on.
It was on?
Shoot.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting questions and comments. Let me start with Michelle's questions because they are easier to answer. Your idea of thinking about your own history as a researcher, Regina, is much more difficult to answer. No, it's not, but it's a very important question. So my aim is to deconstruct the modern Tyrolean cuisine, the modern notion of what is called Tyrolean cuisine, and I want to give the locals some input to think about their own Tyrolness, about their own cuisine, and the Tyroleans should become more open. They should perceive their own cuisine as made through the centuries, and I would say not through the century, mainly in the last 20th century, because we had some huge political problems. And I want to show that Tyroleans and Tyrol, and for me nowadays it's the area of the European region of Tyrol, and which is quite neutral. And I want to show that there is much more than Knödel and Kaiserschmarrn, and so therefore I'm interested in cookbooks deriving from private collections. In the 19th centuries, the cookbooks are mostly dated. So I'm interested in handwritten cookbooks, and I'm looking for cookbooks in family collections, within hotel families and gastronomic, with families with gastronomic history. And I want to triangulate these cooking recipes also with, especially for the pre-modern era, with account books, with other descriptions about the agriculture in the area, because I think the special situation in the Central Alps had a lot of impact on the local cuisine, and I wanted to, maybe I don't know what I'm going to find, so maybe Tyrolean cuisine in the 18th century doesn't exist at all, but I want to open up that perspective to show that thinking about Tyrolean cuisine is much more complicated than it is perceived now. And yeah, the disciplinary migration. So I think for me, disciplines often are they put me in a box where I sometimes I think I don't fit in that box. Sometimes they help me, because today I was very nervous because I wanted to be back in my box. But I think if we share our history as a scholar, it's easier to understand where we come from and why we see certain things like we see them. So I think we need disciplinary migrations to open up our minds, yeah.
Welcome to food studies. I want to first address Michelle's question. How do you recognize? And as scholars and researchers, there are things that we pick out as significant. However, then when we go back and talk to people, we discover that it's not. So with soda bread, I started doing research in the Republic of Ireland. Is this iconic? It's just soda bread. It's just what we eat for breakfast. Big deal. And I was like, wait a minute, you just ruined my entire thesis. So there's some wonderful scholars working out of Iceland who talk about cultural heritage. You recognize that you have found something that is a vernacular form of heritage when the people start nodding and smiling. I said, yes. And that's frequently, as a folklorist, I deal with oral tradition and ethnography, frequently working with communities in which I am living. Is very, very different from anthropology in that way. And so when I have an idea, I wrote about green bean casserole in the Midwest. Why were these people eating this? But I was trying to figure out what it meant to them. And I would just casually say to people, green bean casserole for Thanksgiving? I said, oh, yes, of course. So we start getting affirmation of our interpretation in that way, which is difficult to code or to scientifically prove. So it makes it a more slippery, to use Carol Coonhan's phrasing. Should I answer the other questions now? Okay. Race, of course. And in the Irish context, the word race is very, very tricky. And I'm very cautious about using it. Historically, the English portrayed the Irish as a lesser race, with imagery of monkeys and gorillas and all. And that carried over to the U.S. too. And then it was used as a way to exploit the Irish workers and Irish immigrants. So partly because of that, it's very loaded, and then using it for a group that has white skin. So there has actually been pushback in ethnic studies from Africanists who did not like Irish American, or scholars of Irish American history, using the word race to refer to white people. So we're talking about interdisciplinary issues too. So it's not just a matter of being respectful of Irish American culture. There's within the scholarship, I know that there's this debate in ethnic studies, because I also taught in ethnic studies, over whether or not the Irish could be considered a racial group, and people who were very upset that the Irish in America would use race to describe them. So it's a very tricky kind of minefield.
I wasn't suggesting that you use Irish American as a race. It's rather that Irish Americans are coded, or have been, like their coding has switched and is slippery, yes. Right? And that they are now, unless you declare yourself, people won't know your ancestry unless they know something about your family name or something like that. So, and the box you would tick on your form at the U.S. Census is racial. It's not, so it's not that to encourage you to use Irish American as a race, but rather to grapple with the idea of Irish Americans being able to slip in and out of whiteness, and and in fact being in whiteness, not slip out of it, but that to choose to occupy ethnicity, where you just occupy this racial category, but also occupy. That's what I was suggesting, not suggesting that you use, just to be clear, not to use race, Irish American as a race, not at all. Yeah.
Well, and that kind of speaks to our interdisciplinarity, and the hesitation that you had, feeling like you didn't quite fit in here, because there is a field of scholarship called Irish American Studies, and an excellent book on how the Irish became white. And so whenever I started talking about Irish American history and culture, there were people who were much more knowledgeable than I am who were saying, oh, no, at this point. And then when I talk about Irish culture, fortunately I could send things to Regina and she would say yes or no. But I don't speak Irish. And so I don't have the validity that I would need to speak with authority about Irish culture. So it kind of goes back to the messiness of doing interdisciplinary study, and I think what we need to have a humility about it. I wish some of those other disciplines had humility also. But, so it's very tricky to know how to present our material fully, to contextualize fully without being superficial, and that's a real issue. And when I was doing this with cookbooks, fortunately, Megan Elias has written a wonderful book on the history of cookbooks in America. So I could go to her materials. I'm trusting that she was accurate. So I think we're all dealing with that kind of issue. How do we be interdisciplinary but thorough and scholarly at the same time? So.
Okay, great. So we should open up the discussion.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful panel. Very informative, very thought-provoking. I have a question for Barbara. I was wondering if in your research you have had the chance, or will you foresee yourself looking into sources, gastronomic sources in other languages other than German for the Tyrolean area, such as Ladin, Cimbrian, Moceno languages, and how do you think they would fit into the category of Tyrol culture, food cultures? How do they complement the identity? Or do you think that excluding them would point at what Claudia told us in the first night, trying to build a heritage that looks more illustrious, the German heritage of Trieste, for instance? Could it be the same thing for Tyrol? Thank you.
I have to admit I didn't thought about that so far. I didn't thought about that so far, but of course, if I want to address the whole region, I would have to look also for non-German recipe books, if they exist. I'm at the very beginning, so I'm collecting evidences of cookbooks around in the private collections. I have 20 now, and they're all German, but maybe also because I only looked up in German archives so far. So thank you for that. I need to look also on Latin and maybe also Cimbrian, but for that I need other expertise because I'm not able to speak or read or understand that languages.
A quick question to Lucy. So I keep coming back to the use of Irish in the name of the recipe, Irish soda bread. Focaccia, mish, baguette, ciabatta don't need to have any of the ethnic names in them. So I wonder if you think that we are going in that direction, that the Irish are continuously kind of getting wider and wider and we will drop that Irish, or is it just your sense of that?
And I was kind of wondering the same thing, that, if Irish Americans were really white, why do they now call their bread Irish? So are they still doing that? And marketing, tourism comes in, but also pride in being Irish. And, so now it is a marker of something that so many people in the U.S., regardless of their race, actually, and this is the other thing that complicates race. So there was actually an African-American, a young African-American woman who won the international dance competitions in my daughter's age group. She beat her out. My daughter's Irish, American, Italian. So it gets very complicated there. But everyone can say that they have a little bit of Irish in them now. And so it is something that's very attractive. So they want to keep it there because it adds quality to it. And I think there's so many other things going on too where, most of us are now, the general public is aware of that food can express identity. And we're all looking for some kind of grounding, some kind of connection. And here it offers a connection. And since St. Patrick's Day is open to everyone can go to the bars and get drunk at 6 a.m. in the morning now, regardless of race or ethnicity. So it's something that people see as a way to connect with other people, but also connect with an imagined past. And this identity that is seen as just wonderful and delightful and very, very attractive. So I think they're going to say Irish even more now. And they're starting to say Irish, like traditional Irish, farmhouse Irish, and start making some of the qualifiers as people learn more about the actual history.
Regina wants to say
something. I just do a counter response to that. I'm not sure. Maybe you were listing out all the Italian breads. Yeah. So there's a number of those. There's variety, but there's no variety. There's an Irish bread. It's singular. And maybe it's a way of trying to inflame identity in the face of negligence, or just not negligence, I suppose, but in the face of so few things to draw from. And this would connect up with Harissa Diner's assessment of the Irish in America, that they had nothing to contribute to the cookbook. Okay, which in the typical historian, that's true and not true. But I wonder, is it a reflection of that frail cookbook of immigrants in America, that it's not just a bread associated with them, but it has to be doubly associated with them. A particular bread that's associated with Ireland, but then getting the label of location and a collection of people in the form of Irish.
So something else that I looked at was what other Irish recipes were included. The only other Irish recipe was Irish stew. And that was back in the 1950s and 60s. And it was simply beef stew with lamb instead of, and maybe parsnips. You don't see that in most cookbooks now. And Irish coffee. So
yeah, which is a makey-uppy thing anyway. So.
Right, and those are the only Irish recipes.